talk a little bit about is the Marine Corps Marathon. And I guess I sort of call it like what, so we kind of get an idea of what the marathon's about and ham radio's involvement in it, why ham radio operators should get involved, and then how to actually participate. So I just want to talk a little bit about the history of the Marine Corps Marathon. I'll talk a little bit about what amateur radio does as far as the Marine Corps Marathon, some of the positions and roles that the participants would have, and then talk a little bit about how to participate. So the Marine Corps Marathon, I think this is the I can't do the math, 43rd year, I guess, the 43rd Marine Corps Marathon. And so the first one was in 1976. It was actually an idea from someone in the Marine Corps that would, from the Marine Corps Reserves, to try to get a little bit more visibility for the Marine Corps and to get people, you know, to be involved. And also there was, you know, a lot of health, fitness impact or idea on it. So the first one had almost 1,200 runners, and it was primarily over in Northern Virginia. It worked out pretty well, and so by the second year, in 1977, they pretty much doubled the number of runners that participated, and they also extended the course, so now part of it went over into District of Columbia. And so last year's was the 42nd, and now it's up to 30,000 runners in the actual marathon. That's where they kind of cap the number of runners. And then there's also a 10K that has 10,000 runners in it. And that occurs at the same time using part of the same course. So if you've I've never actually been to the start, but this is apparently what the start looks like. And so when the time comes that they fire the cannon, that's the beginning of it. I'm guessing that for probably the next 30, 45 minutes, it's just a mass of people just constantly going through the starting point. And you might say like, oh, well, it's a disadvantage if you're at the back because, you know, the first 20 minutes went by and you didn't even get past the starting line. Well, the runners all have little chips on their shoes, and that's how it triggers. So as soon as they go across the start line, that's when their time begins, and the same thing when they're end. And there's checkpoints along the way that determine that, you know, runners have continued on. And this is kind of important, and this is sort of where our role gets in a little bit, because if a runner gets injured or never completes it, then people wonder, it's like, okay, this person started, they went past certain checkpoints, but they never got to the end. Did that person report into an aid station? Did they get medical assistance? Or did they just walk off the course and decide to go home? So we can help in some of those cases if they reported to an aid station. So let me just talk about amateur radio's part in the Marine Corps Marathon. So with most, you know, public service type events, we always think of, you know, who the served agency, who are we there to serve. So for example, for most of our events that, you know, Paul has been coordinating, it's usually the Montgomery County Roadrunners Club, or I think the most recent one was the Rockville Rotary, did the Twilight Run. So in this case, there's an organization just called the Marine Corps Marathon Organization. So they're the ones that actually organize it. They actually have a staff. They're based out of Marine Base Quantico. And they are the organization that sort of, you know, decides what all is going to happen, plan out the event, where all the venues are going to be. So it's quite a large thing, and actually they pretty much start planning, they started planning the 2018 marathon pretty much like November 1st after last year's marathon. And they'll start planning the 2019 marathon, you know, as soon as this one's over. And I've even heard some things like maybe next year there's been some interest in having an ultra marathon, so they may even include like a 100-mile marathon or a 100-mile race or something, or a 50-mile race as part of this, which boggles the mind. So, you know, the reason that we're there, one of the things that we're supposed to do is basically to pass messages related to the Marine Corps Marathon, and of course, like anything, any message we pass, whether it's for a local public service event or just, you know, even like, you know, traffic messages and things like that, you always want to be accurate and you want to get the message through quickly. The other thing is, so we're supposed to be the eyes and the ears on the course. So on the course, there are a number of Marine volunteers all along the course. There's obviously lots of spectators. There's ham radio operators. I'll talk about the different places that we are on the course. And so the actual term that the Marine Corps Marathon Office has used is that we're basically sort of like the 911 system. So the idea is that the Marines who volunteer to be along the course and help out, as well as volunteer organizations, Boy Scouts, whatever, that help with food distribution, water stops, things like that, they're all told that if you see a runner that needs assistance, go look for the nearest ham radio operator. And basically we're located at water stops, food stations, and generally every half mile along the course. And so, and all the ham radio operators have bright, yellow vests, what do you call that color, the glow-in-the-dark type yellow. And so, the idea is that we're supposed to stand out, and when people see something that's going wrong, they're supposed to go find a ham radio operator. Now, obviously, some people have cell phones, they'll call 911, but that can cause a lot of confusion because they treat everything that occurs as part of the Marine Corps Marathon as a separate thing that has its own dispatch situation and everything else. So when people call 911 and it goes to the regular either Arlington EMS dispatcher, or if it's over on the DC side and it goes to DC, they'll have to try to do something, but if it's on the course, now we have a little confusion. So the idea is primarily that we're supposed to be the 911 that everybody is supposed to go to if there's a runner with a problem. And this is sort of like probably one of the largest events that occurs in the National Capital Region, right? I mean, there have been the marches in DC, the inauguration things, but they're pretty much located in a specific area, like the mall, for example, the July the 4th, or Memorial Day concert. This is something that spans, 2 jurisdictions, 2 states. So it's actually probably the largest event that's ever planned here in the National Capital Region. And so that's part of our mission, is to make sure that this thing happens safely. And also, obviously, we'd like to demonstrate, our role in public service and being another means of communication for these types of events. Any questions, or anyone have any questions?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Suggestion. If we break early, I have a laptop downstairs, or maybe use your laptop. People can register right now.
Yeah, I'll get to that at the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so amateur radio has a pretty big visibility in this. So the Commandant of the Marine Corps, knows that amateur radio is a big part of the whole operation of the event. There's military from all the other branches, Army, Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force. They're all somehow involved, and they have generals and colonels and high-ranking officials who participate in these things too, and they kind of all know that we're sort of like the main communications for things that occur actually on the course. And so, since this is a rather large event, I mean, there's a formal operations plan that's put together, and amateur radio is a key piece of that. It used to be, we were sort of like thought about on the side, but after I don't know how many years now, it's become so apparent to them that it's a critical piece of their operation that's just now part of their operation plan. So they depend on amateur radio to fill that one role. And there are members of Congress, representatives, senators who are spectators who actually run in the marathon, so they're all aware. They see ham radio operators along the course, and of course the 40,000 runners, as well as their friends and family who are there, we'll see them, and the media actually knows about it too. So some of the things that amateur radio does. So obviously, I mentioned we're sort of like the 911 network for things that happen on the course itself. But we use things like APRS to track what they refer to as tactically strategic vehicles. So for example, the lead vehicle at the beginning of the race, just ahead of the first runner, There's a pace vehicle. There's a requirement that runners have to meet a particular pace, and I cannot remember exactly what it is off the top of my head. You know, so many minutes a mile. And there's a vehicle that runs at that specific pace. And if you fall behind that, and you do not get across the 4th Street Bridge back into Virginia ahead of that vehicle, then basically you're out of the race. Because at that point, they have to open the highway and open the bridge to traffic. So anybody who can't make this pace ends up being off the course, and then that's kind of an important thing for them to know all along. So there's 2 ways to get the reports. One is these vehicles have APRS trackers in them, and there's a whole APRS network, and the command center can see it, you know, displayed on a screen. And sometimes they also track like where the division commanders are, things like that. Those are Marines who are in charge of operations within certain sections of the course. And an interesting sort of story is that you know, these commanders are supposed to be within their district. And so I guess one time one of the Marine colonels noticed, it's like, isn't that my commander? And why are they not where I thought they're supposed to be? And they got severely reprimanded for not being where they were supposed to be. The other thing is that, as I mentioned, that, you know, as runners need medical assistance, either, you know, that they require someone to come to see them to help them out, or they actually just, you know, walk into a nearby aid station. Information gets tracked about that, so that later on at the end, if somebody doesn't show up at the end of the course, at least they have some idea, was that person needing medical assistance? And if so, did they go back into the race? Did they say they were just going to go home, or did they end up being transported to a medical facility? And then there's also the medical aid stations also have their own needs for logistics, so they sort of have a little thing that they do. I'll mention that later on when I talk about some nets. There's also this whole idea, there's a back channel. Again, I'll talk about that when I talk about the nets. And it's just another form of backup communication. So, you know, each of the officers, the physicians who are in charge of each aid station, they have cell phones, and they can talk to the, what we call the top doc, who's the medical commander in charge of the entire operation. And if somebody, you know, one of the providers at one of those aid stations needs to consult with the top doc, they can simply call them on their cell phone. But if something happens, the cell phones aren't working or whatever, then there's a ham radio operator there. At least that's an alternative backup means of communication. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about what hams actually do. So, as I mentioned, there's ham located generally at every mile and a half mile marker. So they basically are, you know, watching people as they go by. Sometimes you may actually see something, or what a lot of times will happen is a runner will run past you and say, hey, somebody, you know, look a quarter mile back or something like that needs assistance. Or a spectator may say they notice something and then walk over to you, or one of the Marines sees something and they've been told to seek out the nearest amateur radio operator. So that's the main place we are. So of course that takes care of what? 50-some operators right there, just being at miles and half mile markers. There's a number of food stations, and I cannot remember how many food stations there are, but there's a number of water points. Food stations obviously is where they get snacks, you know, energy bars, oranges, bananas, what have you, and then there's a number of water stops where they can refill any water bottles they have, as well as actually just get water and probably Gatorade as well to drink. So those positions are kind of all sort of similar, and in fact, in some cases, you know, depending on how many operators we have and the location of a food point, water point, or a food station, we may just say, okay, you know, this food stop is like so close to a half mile marker, we just won't bother having a half mile marker operator there. We'll use the food station operator. Now, there's, at the medical aid stations, they have operators, but their role is sort of different because the aid stations, they're radio operations. So all the operations that are on the course, the mile markers, food stops, and water points, pretty much use VHF 2 meters. So it's a regular voice operation, just like we do with our local vets. The aid stations actually use a data network using D-Star data. And they do that because what they're doing is, as a runner comes into the station, they get registered on a piece of, medical form, and a copy of that form then gets handed to the radio operator, who then enters that into a database. And through this D-Star network interface, we can go directly into their database through, I think, a web browser that they use. And they basically enter the information, and then they can bring that record back up and update it, to say the person was transferred to a hospital, or the person, went back into the race, what have you. So that's sort of a special type of operation right there. And then there's net control operators. The net control operators normally are participants in the 2 meter net where all the race, on the race course are. The one thing about the net control position actually is it's not even on the course. It's not even anywhere close to the course, and that's sort of by design. I mean, it used to be when I think I first started volunteering with the Marine Corps Marathon, I don't know, probably somewhere I came to this area in '84, so it was probably like after a year or two or something like that is when I kind of got involved with it. And I've been on, mile markers, and I've been at net control when net control was actually on the course. Did a shadow one time. The idea is, though, that if something really bad happens on the course, you don't want your net control people to be like caught in the mess. So the idea is, if they put us somewhere off the course, then at least we can still manage to have communications with, whatever's going on the course. And the other reason is too, the location that they put us is actually relatively high, so we can pretty much have simplex contact with almost any station that we need to as well if there's some problem with the repeaters. There's EMS liaison, so when we do have somebody reports a runner down, that information is relayed by the ham on the course to an EMS liaison over ham radio, and then the EMS will make sure that they dispatch the appropriate service for that runner. And then there's also shadows. So I mentioned there's these division commanders. They're basically making sure that the water stops within their jurisdiction got set up, and all the equipment is there that's necessary, and if there's any problems, they're supposed to try to understand them. If anything like a really bad event occurs within their jurisdiction, they're sort of like the person in charge that everybody is going to look towards. And then there's the top doc, and top doc is the head medical officer in the Navy who's in charge of all the medical operations associated with the Marine Corps Marathon. And does anyone know what a shadow is, or what a shadow would do? Well, I'll just let everybody know, because I'm seeing some blank stares. So if Terry was the division commander, or Terry was the top doc, I basically become his shadow. And the reason you call it a shadow is like you're kind of like right close to them all the time. You never let them out of your sight. Some of these people like really move around a lot. Like I've been a shadow for race directors, things like that. And they're just kind of always on the move, so you always want to keep an eye on them and stay attached to them. And you're supposed to be able to relay information to them about what's going on, because you're going to hear through the nets what's happening, and if there's some need for the top doc to be aware of a situation that occurred, then you're supposed to relay that information to them. And so it's usually a position that requires a lot of mobility. All right. So I mentioned that there's different nets. The big net that almost everybody would be participating in is a race net, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail here. There's a command net I'll kind of mention a little bit, and why that is important for everybody to be familiar with. And this medical logistics net, that primarily is sort of like a data network. They use packet radio as the backup if the D-Star data network isn't working. And so if they have issues among the stations getting signed into the database or something like that, they have their own little net that they have somebody who's the troubleshooter help desk for them. I'll just mention one other thing. So originally, for these aid stations, the whole process was in fact done with packet radio. So it was sort of like kind of a line command kind of a thing. You know, they would enter information that would get, you know, stored into a database through this line command interface. Kind of like, if you want to sort of think about it, it's like being on the Windows command prompt or Linux command prompt as opposed to using the desktop. So it's kind of crude, but it was very effective. It just wasn't, you know, very easy to use. You had to learn these commands and everything. So then, you know, they came up with this idea. D-Star radios came around. They were able to use the D-Star data network. It's like 1.2 gigahertz. And, you know, it was much faster than what they could do on, you know, 440 packet. And, you know, now they could use actual things like, you know, use it as a data network as opposed to using regular, you know, your regular Wi-Fi or cellular network, and basically have the same kind of capability that at an aid station, there's a PC there that's connected up to a modem to one of these ID, whatever they are, ID1 data radios, and basically they get connected into the network and then they can fill out the forms. The number of people who are familiar with doing the data network is slowly diminishing. The ID1 radio is no longer being made. And as far as I know, ICOM and nobody's really ever come up with the idea of a replacement for it either. So this year, as sort of a proof of technology kind of thing, they are going to be experimenting with something called ARDN, A-R-E-D-N, which is Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network. So the idea is they're going to try it out, see how it works, make sure that, you know, the technology will provide coverage needed to all the aid stations and the command center, and you know, if it works out well, then maybe next year they'll actually use that in parallel. And the idea is that eventually, if this works out, that will become the replacement for the D-Star network. And I'm going to see if I can get somebody to come to a meeting sometime and talk about it, because it's an interesting technology, and I'm not going to go into that here, because that's not the purpose of this tonight.
There are some people that actually still use the packet part over in Virginia.
What's that?
There is a sect of people that still use the packet part over in Virginia.
Yeah, you know, there's one aid station, I forget which aid station, they always say something goes wrong, that the data part never works right, and they have to revert back to the packet.
Yeah, they're in the valley.
Yeah, so, anyhow, so they'll see if this ARDN thing works out better this year. So the big one I want to talk about is the race nets. And so the race nets basically are, if you're on the course at a water point or at a food station, you're going to be on one of the race nets. And we actually used to operate 2 race nets, one in Virginia and one in DC. About 2 years ago, they decided to split DC into 2 separate nets. Part of it had to do with, at the time, that some of the areas on the course require different sets of repeaters to get access to them because of the geography and things like that. And so it was decided to, rather than try to have all these people, because they couldn't be on the same net, so a lot of people couldn't get into the same net, so they decided to split it up. So there's 2 nets for DC and 1 for Virginia. So we pretty much use repeaters. They do some checking around, already have started this year, looking at the different repeaters that have coverage in the DC, Virginia area, check out the coverage, see how well they operate, check out, you know, with the repeater trustees and make sure it's okay for the Marine Corps Marathon to use those that day. And so we come up from that with a list of the repeaters and frequencies, and there's a process that we'll go through and assign them to the different nets. So primarily, each net has 3 repeaters assigned to it. So there's like a primary repeater, a secondary repeater, and a tertiary repeater. And the primary one is the one that usually gives the best coverage to everybody on that net. Sometimes if there's a problem with that, we'll have another repeater also try to get sure that it's a repeater that has good coverage. But you know, sometimes things happen, like on almost, I think the last couple of years, every day on race day, something happens, or one of the repeaters goes down, or something goes wrong, and we can't use it, so we have to follow over to one of the other ones. And then we also usually assign a number of simplex frequencies to use as a backup. If all three repeaters don't work, then we can communicate with the stations, at least on simplex. Sometimes the stations can't hear each other when it's in simplex, but the net control station can hear. Rebecca?
Has there ever been have all three repeaters gone down when you had to use simplex before?
Not that I remember. And I've been at net control for the last several years, so. Yeah, we've never lost more than one repeater on any particular day. So, like I said, that's the positions on the course that use the RaceNet are the mile markers, the water points, and the food station, as well as the division commanders who each have, I think they're divided up into 5 divisions or something like that. And then the EMS folks are on the course. So Arlington EMS will be on RaceNet A, and DC EMS will have a representative on both RaceNet B and RaceNet C. So there's also this command net that there's a very limited number of people who are on that net. There is a place that's set up that's called the Command Operations Center. So that's where, for example, the ranking Marine officers who are in charge are usually there. Representatives from the different police agencies. So, you know, you got DC Metro Police, you have Arlington Police, you have County Police, you have the Park Police, you have, I forget who all the different jurisdictions are that are involved. So they have representatives there. The medical tracking, so the medical net has a representative on the command net as well. So if there's any issues that they have that they need to make sure that the Command Operations Center is aware of, then they can let them know about that. Net control, we're on that net as well. And then there's also a thing called Unified Command, which is normally sort of sits off in the background. And the idea is that I think they operate out of the DC Emergency Operations Center or something. The idea is that if something should happen, like unfortunately like what happened in Boston, then under NIMS, they would take control of the entire event and coordinate all the emergency response that needs to be coordinated, and everybody else then would look to them for direction. So they're on that same net as well. And the command net, primarily we actually use internet chat, we do that for a couple reasons. One is we used to, so one of the things you want to do is you want to keep a log of everything that occurs. And so we have this internet chat, and also each of the RaceNet positions has also somebody on the internet chat as well. So what we used to do is we used to sit here with pieces of paper and write down, all the things that were going on. And then the problem was at the end, you had a pile of papers, and if somebody wanted to know what happened, it wasn't an easy way to find out. So now, basically, this internet chat becomes our log of everything that's going on. Yeah?
When you say internet chat, do you mean over the internet or over some packet radio?
For the last couple of years, actually, have just been using regular internet. We set up a private net using like Wi-Fi kind of stuff, MiFi. So it is accessible to any of the stations who has an internet access, that they can get to this network server and then sign into it.
You can get to it from MedNet too.
What's that?
You can get it from the Med Data Network too.
Oh, yeah, the med stations have them too? Okay, yeah.
We were able to get it.
Yeah, so actually, when we're looking at the chat, then you can see like, Med A or Med Echo or whatever, puts that information that they have as far as what's going on. And it sort of does make it very convenient. And at the end of the day, if somebody had a question about, like for example, if station on the race course calls in and says they need medical assistance for a runner, and we send them over to talk to one of the EMS liaisons. Usually at least we'll put some mention in there about the bib number and what time, and then at least if there's a question later on we can track it. So sometimes maybe the bib number we got wasn't the bib number of the runner that showed up in the aid station, and so now are we talking about two different runners and things like that. So it's just another way to help have a written record, which is always important. And I'll just mention that each of your stations, wherever you are, you should also have a little notebook with you, and you should be making notes about what time you got on your location, when somebody came up to you and said, there's a runner down, and note these things, because it's just important for your own to keep those kind of records. Warren?
Do you set up a bridge using the radios in places that don't have cell coverage for internet access?
We do not. So far, everybody who's had to be part of the IRC chat has been able to have internet access, either because of the facility they're in, or where we are at the net control. We set up a MiFi access point. So usually there's always been a way to do it. We don't do it over the radio. Now with this ARDN thing, that may be an alternative way to do it in the future.
I don't know the details of this. I can imagine that you could set up a gateway across networks. You could, have a MiFi connected to a computer connected to a radio that's bridging.
Yeah, I mean, those things certainly are possible. I don't think we just ever looked into that yet. David?
Do you know what frequency they're planning to run the microwave stuff?
The hardened stuff?
Yeah.
No, not off the top of my head. It's
ubiquity stuff.
It's ubiquity equipment, and it's in the amateur band that's associated or nearby the 5 gigahertz, 2 point whatever gigahertz. So it avoids the interference from like the standard stuff that's in that part 15 part of the band. We're using the amateur part of those bands.
Where is net control located?
So net control is actually located at the Armed Forces Retirement Home, which is in Northwest DC. And it's kind of nice because it's kind of pretty high up on a hill, and I don't really have a good picture of it. We basically are in a big tent. It was like a 20 by 50 tent last year. We set up, tables. We have the 3 nets kind of clustered around, and then we have antennas set up outside. Yeah.
That is the highest point in Washington.
Is it?
Yeah, Armed Forces Retirement Home.
Okay, so that's what makes it a good place. It's off the course, and it gives us really good, convenient simplex coverage of the course as well. Rebecca?
Besides the 3 nets, who else is in the net control tent, the net control area?
I'm sorry?
Besides the 3 nets, is there anyone else over there?
Nope. Nope, it's just us. Yeah.
So,
Can you see the race well from up there?
You can't see anything of the race from up there. In fact, the only way we actually, what we usually do is somebody will bring a TV in, so we can at least, monitor what's going on the TV. It's Channel 4, one of the channels.
Broadcast television?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, somebody usually brings in a TV with a HD receiver. You can get one of those local stations that's covering the event.
Oh. Okay.
Eugene, and then we'll get to
What's the
Isaac.
dates of the event?
You were going to ask me that, weren't you? Go to MCM. Okay, so I'm really bad when it comes to dates and things like that, and I really almost messed up last year. But it's, go to mcmham.org, and there's a calendar there. It'll tell you the dates. It's like October, whatever what is it?
October 28th.
October 20th. It's usually right at the end of October, just before Halloween.
It's usually the last.
Yeah, the last Sunday, yeah. Isaac?
Well, since you mentioned TV, I'm wondering, is that amateur television or just broadcast TV?
No, we're just watching the WRC Channel 4 usually has a coverage of the start and things like that. So we just watch that to see the start.
Wow.
Wow. Any other questions? All good questions.
Cool.
Actually, because I just looked at their calendar, there was also like an all-hands meeting on the 13th. Is that for all volunteers, or is that organizers? Just-
Yeah, okay, so, yeah, that's a good thing to mention too. So 2 weeks before is this all-hands meeting, and the idea is
2 weeks.
everyone, yeah, last year was 1 week, and I forget the reason why, but it's 2 weeks before. And everybody who volunteers, all the hams that volunteer are invited to this. It's actually out at the Armed Forces Retirement Home. Not in a tent though, it's actually inside one of their buildings in the auditorium. And so there's a couple things that happens there. One is we get a briefing from the medical folks from the Navy as to, you know, their perspective on things, because we're primarily acting as their 911 dispatch system. So they kind of tell us about what's going on and what kind of things are especially bad. Just heat is the worst possible thing in the marathon. And if the temperature gets above usually like 60, the number of heat-related incidents really skyrockets. And one year it was really, really cold, like in the 30s. I think it snowed the night before or something like that. That day had the lowest number of incidents. You would have thought like people would trip and fall or, you know, get hypothermia, but apparently runners, they don't have a problem. It's heat is the thing that kills a runner. So that usually is a big thing, is to look at the weather that day, and that's going to have a lot of effect on how busy we are. Warren.
Two questions. So one, how are you giving the messages to relay, and then two, what kind of messages do you intend to relay?
So if I'm on the course and somebody walks up to me and says there's a runner that needs help, so I would call net control and say, you know, net control from mile 20, report of a runner that needs assistance. Somebody said that, you know, they're sitting on the curb. I'm going to go investigate, and once they get the information, then they'll call us back and give us whatever details. And if they decide that it requires medical attention, then we will have them start talking to the EMS folks directly to plan, you know, a way to get them assistance. Whether it's, there's like bike medics, there's medics on like these ATV type vehicles. There's a couple of them that just are walking around that, you know, have access to different areas, so they'll try to get somebody as quickly as possible to provide assistance. So it's usually just minimal stuff. It's like if they need assistance, and important things like, is the person breathing or not? Because that's a really big emergency. Or, you know, did they just, you know, they sprained their ankle? And we've had a lot of people like, you know, somebody will walk up to a ham radio operator and say, somebody back there sitting on a curb looks like they need help. And you go and you find out they're just tying their shoelace or something.
Or resting.
So is there a separate first aid people that are attached to you, or?
No. So all the EMS stuff is handled either through one of the EMS companies like Arlington EMS, through their ambulance fire rescue service, or DC EMS, their fire rescue service. Or if it's on the course and the person isn't too serious, they may just suggest taking them to the nearest aid station where they can get assistance. And at the aid stations, these are operated by the Navy Medical Corps, so they have Navy physicians, they have corpsmen, they have nurses, they have volunteers, so medical people who you know, are not affiliated with the military. You know, each year they can sign up. I think somebody said there's this registered nurse who's been coming out helping at a particular aid station for 20 or 30 years or something like that. So there's also opportunities for medically trained individuals to help volunteer. But as far as the amateur radio operators, our function is merely communications. We don't get involved in providing any, you know, first aid or medical assistance.
And your location is well known, or do you need GPS coordinates?
What's that?
Your location is well known, or do you need GPS coordinates?
So usually what we tell people to do is we'll become very familiar with where you're on the course. So we usually tell people, you know, like maybe the event is on Sunday, to try to plan to go there on Saturday, check out your location, find out where your mile marker is. It's usually like a mark on the pavement somewhere, so when there's thousands and thousands of people around, you may not be able to find it. You can scope out a place to park and things like that. And then become familiar with the landmarks in your area. you know, in front of such and such street address. If you're, usually the GPS thing doesn't really help because I don't know that anybody's really ever tried to give us GPS coordinates. Usually they know pretty accurately where the mile and half-mile positions are on the course. So everyone knows where those are. So if you can kind of get it, you know, to say like, you know, about halfway between mile 20 and 20 and a half, then, you know, that's usually pretty good enough to get them in the general vicinity. And then we ask the operators, and, you know, the operator can a lot of times ask the spectators around to help flag down the EMS when they show up so they can find them. Actually, those are all really good things, and that's actually part of what happens during the all-hands meeting is that, you know, there's training about what you're supposed to do, and there's also an operations manual, so everybody has an operations manual, has like, you know, checklists for things that you should have with you that day, a checklist for what you need to report if you are reporting a problem. So it's got a lot of useful information, and we try to do that at that all-hands meeting. Things like programming radios. So, you know, we're going to have a whole list of frequencies, right? And you should program, even though like maybe you're assigned to RaceNet A, you should still plan to have every frequency on there, because it's possible that Net Control will decide that because of some problem with a repeater, we're going to have you use the repeater that really would have been from some other net. So it's really important to get all those, you know, 16 or 20 channels programmed in your radio. And so on the all hands day, we have people there with laptops, different programming cables, the software for programming different radios, and they'll help get your radio programs to have all the channels in there with the right, you know, designation. So on race day, you're not kind of fumbling around trying to figure out how to put in a frequency or something like that. Now we have all the right frequencies, all the right PL tones. So the other thing I just want to mention, so like I said, that for most positions on the course, a 2 meter HT is usually enough. If you're going to be there for a long time, usually one battery pack isn't enough. So it's usually good to have a spare battery pack. You know, have it charged up in advance. Most of your radios these days, you have an option of getting, in addition to like the LiPo or NiCad or nickel metal hydride or whatever battery, rechargeable battery pack, a lot of them have an option to buy a case that's the same size as the battery pack that you can put alkaline batteries in. And just in general, I recommend anytime you buy a radio, look if that's an option, go ahead and buy one of those things because they're really handy, because then you just need a whole backpack full of alkaline batteries and you could last forever. And just in general, from an emergency perspective, you know, if the power is out, you know, we got a storm or a hurricane or something, your power is out, you're not going to be able to recharge your battery pack anyway. So having a whole ton of alkaline batteries is really a good backup.
Speaking about battery, so if you are buying an HT, make sure it's got an external power connector, typically 12 volts, so you can connect 12 volts to it. And all my HTs have that. I look for that. If I shop for a new HT, it doesn't have that. Well, now look for the second thing. Does the charger take 12 volts? And then you can seesaw between 2 or 3 batteries, keep one charging all the time.
In the car.
Yeah, because typically you're near your car. Or
Chill cell?
yeah, or a small battery,
Yeah.
which is still heavy. A 10 ampere hour battery is about 10 pounds. Yeah.
And actually up at Net Control, we have a generator, but the generator is primarily for operating things like a coffee pot and microwave. We actually operate all the radios off batteries.
Oh yeah.
I'm saying the coffee pot's the emergency.
Yeah, that's an important. When you get started at like 3 o'clock in the morning, you need that coffee or whatever. So, so the other thing I'm just going to mention is, you know, the time commitment. You know, everybody's got different requirements on how much time they can spend. You know, the important thing is don't worry about this, but just remember that when you register to volunteer, there's a comment thing and put in there if you have any kind of restrictions, like I'm not available, I can only be available until noon or something like that, so we'll be sure to assign you some early mile marker on the course, so you'll be done, you know, by 10 or 11 o'clock. So if you, you know, we're at net control usually starting around between 2 and 3 a.m. until it's all done and we've taken all our equipment down, which is usually like 5 p.m. So it's usually, you know, about 15 hours.
A lot of places got to be on the course before a road shutdown.
Yeah, so if you're like, especially around like the Pentagon area, the Finnish area, around where the Marine Corps Memorial is located, they have really rigid security restrictions, and they'll start shutting down the road at something like 2 a.m.
Oh,
So if you are assigned to some location there, you want to be sure to be in there before they close the roads at 2 a.m. Most of the roads around will close later in the day, so it's not as much of a problem.
Not only that, but if you have to stop by that location, by the Pentagon to pick up your gear.
Yeah, yeah, so actually that's here.
Across the river.
Yeah.
I got caught last year at 3:10 in the morning or something. I had to go south to get across 395 to get into Washington. It was a hassle.
Yeah,
Now
so
I know why they say get there at 2 a.m.
yeah, so there's so there's a check-in point that everybody goes to pick up their stuff, and so I mean they give you a credential, they give you a parking permit if you're going to be on the course, they give you your meals, so they do provide you with a breakfast and a lunch. Or what they call a breakfast and a lunch.
That's more accurate.
Yeah. I always bring my own food.
Yeah.
And they provide you with the vest. And that vest is really important because that's the thing that everybody is told to look for. Look for the ham radio operator with their vest. And then you unfortunately don't get to keep those. You do have to turn them in as that rear pace vehicle passes by. Because basically, once that passes by, everybody behind it is kind of out of the race, and so at that point, you toss your vest into the radio, into the window.
Into the window of the vehicle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's usually an open window. I don't know. Well, I don't know. Sometimes I forget. Sometimes there's only one person in there, and they're trying to drive, and they don't have time to reach out. So, if there's an open window, you toss it in the window.
And then at the very end, there's straggler bus, the people were still left behind.
Right, and actually that was one of those other tactically strategic vehicles, although sometimes we do have an operator for them so we know where they are, sometimes unfortunately we don't know where they are. So,
Very, very far behind.
yeah, oh, here's a little quiz question because this always comes up every year. Somebody says, how will I know the rear pace vehicle? Everybody calls and say, can you give me a description of the rear pace vehicle? Do you need a description? What's that?
It's the only vehicle there.
Yeah, it's the only car since the race started. The first car you see after the race started is that rear pace vehicle.
Oh.
Yes.
It's the second lead.
No, so it's after the lead vehicle, the next vehicle you see is the rear pace vehicle. There are no others. It's just all runners in there.
Okay.
So people always say, like, well, how will I know it when I see it? It's like, look for a vehicle. And if so actually what happens is, when somebody turns in their vest, pretty much they're done. So they'll call net control and say, net control for mile 20, I just turned in my vest, I'd like to secure my station. And, we'll say, okay, thanks for helping us, whatever. So if you're at mile 21, you know that whatever that rate is, 14 minutes from now, that vehicle is going to show up on your doorstep.
Wait, so the rear pace vehicle, I know it's the second vehicle, but where in the race is it going to be around?
They drive right down the course.
Are they at the end? Are they at the end?
They're at the end of so there's basically
They are the definition of the end.
Yeah, they are the definition of the end. So they're told to drive at a very specific rate. I forget if it's like 14 miles an hour, 14 minutes a mile. They're supposed to drive at the rate at which a runner is supposed to run and make the bridge at the right time. If you're not going at that rate, I think it's that you have to do 1 mile every 14 minutes or something like that. And if you're not keeping up with that rate, you won't make the bridge in time because they're going to open it to traffic and then you're out. So that's why everybody has to beat this thing. you'll hear this term, beat the bridge. It's like, you know, a thing like everybody knows they got to get across the bridge, because after they get across the bridge, they're okay, because now it's not something like they're going to open a highway on you and things like that.
It's like 2:30.
What's that?
Too slow.
I'm sorry.
Cruise control. Do you use cruise control?
No, I don't know. They're supposed to actually, you know, watch a stopwatch.
Drive that slowly.
Well, actually, newer vehicles can be controlled at much lower speed.
Yeah.
So
So
the new CRV can.
that's their problem. We don't worry about how they do
You may
it.
want to wait for the straggler bus to pass. Before you,
What's that?
You may want to wait for the straggler bus.
I mean, some people will do that just to let us know where the straggler bus is, but I can tell you sometimes it may be an hour or so, and most people don't want to stick around. And we don't require you to stick around. Once that rear pace vehicle passes you and you've turned in your vest, that's when you can tell us that you would like to secure, and we'll release you from that.
But you can only leave when the road gets open, so you gotta see when the cones are lifted and the police officials say you can go. You can't leave until then.
Yeah. So again, and it depends on where you are. You know, I mean, you may have been in a position that now you can walk off the course far enough away where you were able to park, and you're not affected by it. So it just kind of depends.
Right.
All right, so how to participate. So a couple things I just want to mention. You know, I talked about some of the reasons to volunteer. This is really a good opportunity to get experience in working with a direct-to-net. But you know, if you've helped out with any of the local events we've done, you already got an experience with a direct-to-net. And direct-to-net, by the way, means that there's a net control station, and people that want to talk ask the net control station, and then the net control station, you know, acknowledges them. So it's not everybody jumping in a round, you know, fashion. And even the Sunday night net is basically a direct-to-net, right? It's we got a net control station, or I like to refer to them as the host. But you know, everybody checks in, they keep track of who checked in, and then they go back to those people and ask them if they have any comments. So it's still a direct-to-net. And I encourage people just, you know, participate in nets, but also get some experience being a net control operator. The Sunday night net is a perfect one because it's really pretty much, you know, as informal as you get. Dave?
We're also taking volunteers for the Thursday night field day.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, I mean, there's the Sunday night net, there's the Thursday night net, there's the Tuesday night emergency and public service net. We're always looking for people who want to, you know, get experience being net control operators, and it's just a really good experience to have. And it's not that difficult. You know, pretty much I just usually have a piece of paper and I just write down call signs, and I have little notations that I put next to them about like whether they had a comment, so I know whether to go back to them or not. And you know, it's pretty kind of simple, and then I just check them off so I know that I went back to them if they needed me to. It is sort of an opportunity, so like, you know, our nets that we do with the running events are typically, you know, what, three hours or something like that maybe. So this is an opportunity to be, get some experience with a longer deployment. You have to be prepared for a vast array of weather, right? Because sometimes it's like 35 degrees when you get out there at 4 a.m. in the morning, but by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it could have warmed up to 65 or 70. So you have to really be prepared for a large, layer kind of stuff. So, and of course the other thing is just in general, like we do with Field Day, is we want to promote amateur radio and our capabilities. And every volunteer every year we get a really nice t-shirt, and these are not like, you know, like the screen printed ones. These are like embroidered, and you can check out, Alex is wearing one. She can model it for you. It's a really nice turtleneck, long sleeve t-shirt that's embroidered.
You already got it.
So, yeah, oh yeah, so it's cool. And it's embroidered and everything, so I'm modeled. Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Is there a place to get them there to order them?
No, so that's one of the things that you get when you go to the check-in place.
At 5 in the morning.
Yeah, so when you signed up online, you told them your shirt size, what shirt size you want. And then when you go there that day, that's one of the things they'll give you. They'll give you the size shirt that you told them you needed. So don't tell them you need a large if you need an extra, extra large. 'Cause it's just not going to work out. All right. So, the Marine Corps actually tells us we need about 135 hams. We figure we really need more like 150. So last year we had 130 people sign up on actual race day. There was only a little over 100. So, you know, people don't show up. I mean, we understand sometimes, you know, illness comes up, things happen in the family, what have you. People get injured, they just can't make it. One thing that the guy in charge of all the ham radio operators does, he gives everybody a cell phone and says, if you can't make it that morning, call my cell phone and let me know, because the last thing they want to do is have somebody not show up, we don't know whatever happened to them. If you can't make it, let us know, because then the sooner he knows that, he can start planning to maybe reassign people. So that's another reason why we said have your radio program for every possible frequency, because you know, maybe when you get in at the check-in point, they may say, oh, you were going to be here, would you be able to go to a slightly different place instead, because we're short operators and we're going to have to shuffle people around. So, you know, we definitely need somebody at every mile marker. Sometimes we don't need everybody at half-mile markers, except like the last 6 miles of the course, because that's where so many things can happen that, you know, we really want people to be concentrated in that area. So the rest of this is really just a number of screens, and I'm not really going to go through all them. The important thing here is there's a 2-part process, and like Dave said, I mean, I can get on here with the internet afterward if you want to come up, and there's still time, and you want to sign up right here and now, we can get you signed up. But there's a 2-part process. There's a Marine Corps ham website, mcmham.org, and that's basically the URL that you want to go to. So anyway, you sign up for this location, and then after you've gone through that, you will get an email that gives you another link to the Marine Marathon website where you sign up as a volunteer. And they basically have their own website. You go to marinemarathon.com. There's a thing at the bottom for volunteer. You click on that, and there's a whole list of volunteer things. Remember I said you could volunteer to be at a water point. You know, ham radio operators actually I think is the very first one at the top, because I think I don't know, we're lucky we're at the top. And so you sign up through that, and that way you also be sure, both places will ask you what t-shirt size you want. Be sure you have it correct on both of them, because it's never clear to us which piece of data they're going to take. If they don't match, I think the Marines actually supply the t-shirts based on the information that you put on this site here. So be sure it's correct. And you go do that, and then you'll get a confirmation from them that you're signed up as a volunteer. I've pointed out to the webmaster for the MCM ham site that we should also be sending them some sort of a confirmation, right, because you don't get any confirmation from them, so you don't really know for sure if they got it or not. So I think they're looking into that. So don't be surprised if you don't get a response from us, but just be sure you get one from the Marine Corps. And we get a list of database from the Marine Corps that has everybody who signed up as a ham, and then they'll match it up with what's on the website. So if you sign up from the Marine Corps, but it's a problem, so be sure to sign up for both. We can really be shorthanded, so I mean, don't be afraid to do it, even if it's your first time. If you've checked into like one of the Sunday night nets and you kind of have the idea, you know how to operate your radio and how to respond to net control when you're called and things like that, and the protocol and all that's going to be in this operating guide you get. And so I would rather see as many people as possible be willing to be on the course than have, you know, 5 people in one place. But that's my perspective. And for last year, and I guess I volunteered again this year, I'm actually the lead at the net control. So I've been doing net control for a few years, so I decided to step up to that. And any other questions? And feel free to drop me an email, k3csx@arrl.net, if you have any questions. And hopefully on RaceNet Day, we'll see you on the roster.
Okay, well, thanks, Fred. That was
Sure.
a terrific presentation.
Awesome.